The following account is quite detailed, so I will delve straight into it, focusing only on the pertinent information. I am 22 years old, having recently graduated from college. My family has resided in a 3-story house in a relatively pleasant neighborhood since I was about 3 or 4. If you're imagining the archetypal suburban setting, you're picturing it correctly. Regarding the house's layout, this is all you need to know. My bedroom, located on the 2nd floor, features a window facing the street. Similarly, the sole window in my dad's home office, on the 3rd floor, also overlooks the street. That's the extent of it. The reason I am relaying this story is that, following the events of last week, I'm now utterly convinced that something ominous is befalling my family for some incomprehensible reason I cannot even begin to grasp. And if my deductions are accurate, which I am fairly certain they are, this has been ongoing for years. The first significant incident occurred so long ago that I cannot recall my age, but I was young enough to still be in middle school, placing it at least a decade ago. It was either a Saturday or a Sunday, as I had no school. While descending the stairs for breakfast, I overheard my parents conversing in the kitchen. I didn't catch much of their discussion, but I did hear my dad mention that something had happened again, and judging by his tone, it must have been somewhat troubling. My parents didn't disclose what was going on when I inquired. In fact, they didn't tell me directly for over a year afterward, but I learned the true story a few days later from my older brother. My dad, a lawyer, often works late into the night when under pressure to complete tasks not finished at the office. This is precisely what he was doing until about 2 a.m., the night before I overheard his conversation with my mom about the incident. According to my dad, around midnight while working at his desk, he noticed a Chevy Suburban driving down the street at approximately 5 miles per hour. This is not an exaggeration. He maintains to this day that the car appeared to be crawling down the street, as if someone had released both the accelerator and brake, allowing the vehicle to merely idle forward. My dad didn't give it much thought until he saw the exact same car drive back down the street, this time in the opposite direction. Then, even more strangely, the car actually parked directly across the street, right in front of our house. My dad focused on the car for several minutes, waiting to see if anyone would exit or if it would depart, but neither happened. The car simply remained there. My dad lacked the time or patience to spend the rest of the night watching the car, so he returned to work, occasionally glancing out the window out of curiosity, but nothing stirred for hours. He swore no one ever left the car, as he would have noticed movement from the window if they had. Eventually, he fell asleep at his desk around 2 a.m., his work unfinished. But here's the astonishing part. When he awoke around 5:30, the car was still there, in the identical spot. What transpired while he was asleep remains a mystery, but my dad stated he was so startled to see the car still there upon waking that he thought he was dreaming. The car ultimately left before sunrise, and even after completing his work, my dad was too unsettled to sleep. I would eventually learn that this wasn't the first instance of something similar occurring, that my dad had previously seen cars driving back and forth on our street late at night. But this was undoubtedly the most bizarre. No one in the family truly gave it much thought for several years, though. It was most likely just someone sleeping in a highly coincidental location. At worst, it was someone driving through random upscale neighborhoods, casing houses. Fast forward a few years. I'm now 15, a sophomore in high school. I recall the second occurrence far more distinctly, partly because it was more recent, and partly because it directly involved me. I was up late making beats in my room, a frequent activity during that period of my life. As I mentioned earlier, my room has a window facing the street, which I can always see out of since my desk is directly in front of it. I was engrossed in my music with headphones on when something outside my bedroom window caught my eye. It was a faint flicker of light, undeniably unnatural, and certainly not my imagination. I shifted my attention to the window and witnessed the strangest, most unnerving sight. There was a convoy of cars, at least 3 of them. They were driving slowly down the street. That alone doesn't sound too bad, but I quickly realized that the occupants of the cars were shining flashlights at houses. That was the source of the flicker of light. I continued watching in a state of confused anxiety as whoever was in the first car swept their flashlight beam across the house adjacent to mine. Then they began shining their light at my house, and I actually ducked beneath my windowsill when I realized the beam was about to pass directly across my window. Not 2 seconds after ducking, I watched the flashlight beam illuminate my ceiling for a couple of seconds before everything went dark again. I waited a good 20 seconds before re-emerging, and by then, the cars were much further down the street. I watched as they reached the end of the street and turned off. You can probably imagine how I felt in that moment. It was difficult to get much sleep after that. I obviously told my parents about it the next morning, and as a family, we collectively agreed that it was a group of thugs casing houses, likely searching for unoccupied ones that would make easy targets for a home invasion. My dad installed a Ring camera after that, and he even placed security cameras with motion-activated lights in our backyard. Cannot recall for certain, but I think my parents might have spoken to a few of our neighbors to see if anyone had experienced something similar. A couple of years later, the next event transpired. While performing some landscaping in our backyard, one of the contractors my dad had hired claimed to have discovered a small, hidden camera tucked into one of the bushes near the fence. It was tiny, no larger than a car key, but it was definitively a camera. It was battery-powered, and the battery had long since died. It contained no SIM card or memory card, meaning it wasn't storing anything locally or using cellular data. But that didn't rule out the possibility that it had been streaming footage to an external device nearby while active. My dad said the most probable explanation was that someone had been parked close enough to receive a live feed until the battery expired. Why anyone would go to the trouble of concealing something like that on our property and then simply abandon it was a complete enigma to us, but it certainly wasn't the kind of thing you stumble upon accidentally. As furious as my dad was, he couldn't ascertain when or who had placed it there. Even after sifting through the past few months of security camera footage, or at least everything the device had recorded and stored, I was convinced that one of my friends had been pranking us. However, despite pestering all of them, no one confessed to placing that camera there. My parents were genuinely worried we were being targeted, and they even reported everything to the police. But the home security system they had already installed was quite excellent, so it wasn't as if they could significantly upgrade things. Nothing happened for a while after that. It wasn't like a pall hung over us. We all simply moved on with our lives, as most people probably would. The next noteworthy incident occurred a few years after we discovered the camera. Our immediate next-door neighbors moved away, and their house was reoccupied very quickly. It was vacant for only a few weeks at most. This isn't exactly the most unusual thing. My neighborhood has always been a very desirable place for families to live. However, I noticed pretty quickly that the people who moved in weren't parents, just a youngish couple with no children. I remember finding that odd considering the size of the house, but I assumed maybe they were planning on starting a family, or perhaps they simply wanted a large space all to themselves. On several occasions after they moved in, though, I caught them looking into our yard through their top floor window, always at strange hours, either very early in the morning or very late at night. At first, I figured they had a workstation or office up there, like my dad, and they were just seated right in front of the window. But then I noticed they were always standing, which eliminated the desk hypothesis. I knew I was just being paranoid, but I'm a pretty observant person by nature. So if someone is going to do something out of the ordinary, I'm going to notice it. Either way, I didn't think much of it. I merely found it mildly amusing that our neighbors seemed fascinated with the layout of our yard, or whatever else it was they were always looking at. One night, while walking my dog on the street, I couldn't help but notice my neighbors in their kitchen through their large bay window. They were sitting at a table, and for the first time since they had moved in, there was a third person with them. The guy had very distinctive features. He was completely bald, very muscular, and possessed the thickest eyebrows I had ever seen. The three of them, he and the couple, were simply sitting and talking at the table. Nothing unusual. But as if they noticed me looking, the woman swiftly walked over to the window and pulled the curtains closed. She didn't actually look out the window at me. None of them did. Nonetheless, a persistent sensation lingered that her curtain closure was a purposeful act, stemming from her awareness of my observation. Irrespective, the man accompanying them remained etched in my memory. His countenance was exceptionally striking. Frankly, I'm at a loss for further description. At this juncture, you might be inclined to label me as a paranoid schizophrenic, a conclusion I would also reach. However, I would never convey this narrative if the subsequent events hadn't unfolded. As initially stated, these incidents occurred last week. Approximately a few years after the last encounter, I recounted several weeks prior. My family embarked on a journey to Paris. My elder brother had been in a long-term relationship, and a proposal was widely anticipated during this trip, particularly as we were accompanied by his girlfriend's family. A few days into our vacation, we found ourselves in a nondescript bar. Our entire party, my parents, my brothers, his girlfriend, her parents, and I, was present. We were comfortably seated in a booth, conversing and enjoying beverages. About halfway through my drink, my attention drifted from the conversation, and I happened to glance across the establishment. A man sat alone in a booth, casually sipping his drink and surveying the room. He struck me as familiar, yet I couldn't immediately recall where I had seen him. Then, with an abrupt clarity, it registered. He was the very man I had observed at my neighbor's kitchen table years ago. The realization was disorienting. I resisted believing it. What were the odds that this random individual from my neighborhood would be in the same bar as my family, in a foreign country no less? I tried to rationalize it as a mere coincidence. Yet, the longer I focused on him, the more convinced I became of his identity. Suddenly, he caught my gaze. Our eyes interlocked for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few seconds. An unspoken understanding passed between us. I knew, and he knew I knew. I sensed it profoundly. Without finishing his drink or settling his tab, he rose and vanished from view. I promptly excused myself from the table, attempting to follow him, but he had disappeared without a trace. Defeated, I returned to the table, striving to quell the disturbing feeling that had overcome me. The only way to salvage my evening and maintain my composure was to attribute it to him simply being on vacation at the same time as us. A few days later, engaged in typical tourist activities in broad daylight, I saw him again while we were walking through the city. The same individual. The shock was immense. If the initial encounter had been a coincidence, this second sighting completely dismantled that theory. He stood roughly 50 feet away, capturing images with what appeared to be a professional camera. Although I couldn't be certain, it seemed as if the camera was directed towards us, despite a renowned monument positioned behind us. I watched as he then rounded a corner and disappeared. It was at this point that I finally confided in my parents, providing every minute detail and assuring them of my sanity. To my surprise, my parents, especially my father, believed me. He even suggested cutting our trip short. While we didn't end up doing so, the remainder of our vacation was colored by an underlying dread. Upon our return home, my father reviewed all available security footage, but found nothing. I am truly bewildered by these events. I have no idea what these individuals want from us, or even who they are. But I am now convinced they have been monitoring us for over a decade, a notion that sounds utterly irrational, and I have every reason to believe things will only intensify from this point forward. I reside close to Angel National Forest and have frequented its trails for years, possessing a familiarity that eliminates any concern about getting lost or similar worries. I am at ease in that environment, The evening these particular events unfolded, I had received distressing news via phone earlier in the day, the kind of news that compels one to leave the house and seek mental clarity. While some cope with upset by drinking or calling a friend, my solace lies in hiking. I set out around 8 p.m. with no ambitious plans, merely seeking to clear my mind and perhaps exhaust myself sufficiently to achieve sleep upon my return. Night hikes are not uncommon for me, especially on familiar paths. There's typically a meditative quality to being out there in the dark. However, the fog that night was extraordinary. Although I had checked the weather prior to leaving, conditions at higher elevations are always unpredictable. Within a short distance, visibility had dwindled to approximately 20 feet. Everything beyond that was a uniform gray. Initially, I attempted to use my flashlight, but its beam merely reflected back from the airborne moisture, exacerbating the situation, much like driving with high beams in a snowstorm. Consequently, I kept it mostly off, allowing my eyes to adjust to the faint ambient light. I had music playing, a habit learned from my father, intended to deter any wildlife. About an hour into my hike, I detected a peculiar scent. It was subtle at first, prompting me to momentarily halt, so unexpected was it. It wasn't the natural aroma of wood, rather it resembled perfume, which I acknowledge sounds absurd, yet that was its genuine essence. It wasn't potent or overwhelming, just a distinct floral note that felt entirely out of place. I glanced around, an ultimately futile gesture given the limited visibility in the fog. By the time I had completed my scan, the scent had dissipated. Unsure of what to make of it, I simply dismissed it. Approximately 10 minutes later, however, a new aroma emerged. This time, it was something more recognizable: campfire smoke. I immediately connected the dots. Someone must be camping nearby, which likely also accounted for the earlier perfume scent. Yet this aroma lingered for only about 30 seconds before vanishing, a slightly peculiar occurrence. It wasn't until I encountered the third scent that I truly began to feel uneasy. It was an herbal, almost earthy fragrance that I instantly recognized from my childhood, though I couldn't pinpoint its origin. The combination of its familiarity and its utterly out-of-context appearance unsettled me profoundly. I probably should have retreated the moment things felt amiss, but I continued hiking. Things remained normal for a while, and my sense of unease began to diminish. But just as a flicker of calm settled over me, I spotted a flashlight beam on the ridge to my left. This ridge runs parallel to the main trail, but lies approximately 100 feet higher. There are no marked trails or access points up there, a fact I know well from repeatedly consulting maps, hoping to discover a way up. The terrain is simply too treacherous. One would also have to bushwhack through severely difficult terrain to reach that elevation from my position. And yet, unmistakably, someone was up there. The beam would illuminate a section of the ridge, then extinguish, only to reappear a few seconds later elsewhere. In that precise moment, I realized my music had become a significant liability. I turned it off and listened intently. Whoever was up there was whistling, which, while seemingly innocuous, unnerved me. If I could hear their whistling, they would certainly have heard my recently playing music. By this point, I was several miles into the trail. The logical course of action would still have been to turn back, but I resisted the urge. I knew of a small overlook ahead, so I resolved to take a break there and collect my thoughts. However, upon reaching it, I encountered something that intensified my apprehension 100-fold. A stone sculpture rested on a flat rock near the edge of the overlook. I instantly understood its implication. I immediately stood up, spun around, and began retracing my steps. But then, from seemingly nowhere, I heard rapid footsteps approaching me from the direction I was walking. It was unmistakable. 100% human footsteps, not an animal's. I had no time to process. The footsteps were so close that my only option was to stand my ground and brace for an encounter. There was no time to flee. Yet, just as the footsteps were upon me, they abruptly ceased. It was profoundly terrifying. I continued to peer into the fog, but saw nothing. A part of me theorized that whoever had just charged me was now motionless, just outside my field of vision, but that made no logical sense. If I couldn't see them, how could they possibly know my exact location? I waited a few more seconds, then produced the switchblade I always carried for protection. I held my position, anticipating whether I would see or hear something, bracing for an attack. But now an absolute silence prevailed. I was at a loss. I didn't want to announce my presence, but I was fairly certain that whoever was out there already knew I was there. What made the situation even more dire was that the footsteps had originated from the very direction I needed to go to return. There was no alternative route. To leave, I had to walk directly toward where those footsteps had come from. I tried to hold out, but I couldn't linger indefinitely, so I started moving. I fully expected to eventually encounter someone, at which point I frankly don't know what I would have done. But the deeper I ventured into the fog, the more I began to think that whoever had been there had somehow slipped away without me hearing them. The paranoia was excruciating. Every few minutes or so, I swore I heard one or two additional footsteps, as if someone was matching my pace from behind. I constantly looked over my shoulder, but each time, there was only fog. This continued for approximately a mile. It was genuinely the most tense mile of my life. I was being stalked. I was absolutely certain of it. Suddenly, something burst through the undergrowth behind me. The noise was so deafening that I involuntarily recoiled. This time I lost all composure and involuntarily shrieked in sheer terror. I spun around towards the source of the commotion, but once again, my gaze met only empty space. At that moment, a genuine conviction settled over me that I would not survive this forest. So I took off running. I can't explain why it took me so long to start, but once I did, I didn't stop until I reached my car. The entire time, I heard a crashing sound persistently following me from somewhere behind. I was definitely being pursued, but I disregarded it. I still view it as a miracle that I returned to my car unharmed. I avoided hiking for several months after that experience, and the events of that night remain a mystery to me. This occurred nearly 2 decades ago when I was 15 years old. My parents were in the throes of a messy divorce at the time, and my mother decided it would be best for me to spend a few weeks with my great-aunt Lucy in upstate Vermont while they sorted out the legalities. I wasn't thrilled about being sent away to a relative I barely knew, but I had little choice in the matter. Aunt Lucy resided in a sizable Victorian house that had been converted into apartments sometime in the 1960s. She owned the entire building, renting out the top 2 floors to tenants while she occupied the expansive first-floor unit alone. The place possessed a distinct old-world charm: high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and intricate moldings around every doorway, much like something from a movie. What immediately struck me as peculiar was Aunt Lucy's apparent avoidance of certain areas within her own apartment. She had a magnificent master bedroom with tall windows and exquisite antique furniture, yet she chose to sleep in a small den adjacent to the living room. That was actually one of the first things I inquired about, to which she simply responded that the main bedroom received too much morning light. I then foolishly asked if I could sleep there instead, and she simply cast a disapproving glare my way. It's important to remember that times were different then, and respecting one's elders was practically law. So, after that exchange, I held my tongue, unwilling to provoke her further. During my initial nights there, I repeatedly heard what sounded like someone walking around in the apartment above us. I assumed it was just one of the tenants, perhaps someone who worked late shifts. However, the unusual aspect was the methodical nature of the walking, a steady back and forth rhythm, as if someone were pacing the length of the apartment. After about a week of this, I couldn't keep it to myself and mentioned it to Aunt Lucy during breakfast. She again gave me that strange look and stated that the second floor had been vacant for over a month. I insisted I had been hearing someone walking up there every night, but but she merely shook her head and told me I was just hearing the building settling. Her explanation didn't make sense, but I wasn't about to argue. The next morning, I told Aunt Lucy I wished to see the vacant apartment. She appeared reluctant, but I persisted, and eventually, she consented. Just as she had stated, the second floor was completely empty. As we walked through the rooms together, however, I noticed something that immediately validated my nocturnal observations. Fresh scuff marks on the hardwood floors, as if someone had walked the same path repeatedly. The marks formed a clear pattern from the front of the apartment to the back, precisely mirroring the route the footsteps seemed to take each night. When I pointed this out, Aunt Lucy claimed the marks were probably from the previous tenants, but they looked too recent for that. I told her this, but she merely dismissed me as if I were a babbling child. That evening, she suggested we watch a movie together, an activity we had never done before. As it grew later, the footsteps from upstairs resumed. I looked at Aunt Lucy, expecting her to finally acknowledge what we were hearing, but instead, she simply turned up the volume and pretended nothing was happening. I was stunned. My immediate thought was that Aunt Lucy knew exactly what was going on and simply preferred not to tell me. The following day, I called my mom and mentioned the situation, and, surprisingly, even my mom seemed aware of what was happening. She instructed me not to bring up the footsteps with Aunt Lucy anymore, stating that it was a sensitive topic. One night, close to the end of my visit, I awoke around 2 a.m., needing to use the bathroom. As I was returning to my room, I glanced towards the staircase leading to the second floor. The door at the bottom was slightly ajar, and I could have sworn I saw a faint light moving around up there, as if someone were walking with a flashlight. I immediately returned to bed and did not mention it to Aunt Lucy. I simply wanted to get out of there. If it hadn't been for that night the two of us watched a movie, I would have assumed Aunt Lucy was causing the footsteps, but that was impossible. My mom refused to explain things to me when I got back home, and this actually created a significant rift between us. Years later, I learned through a cousin that Aunt Lucy had sold the building and relocated to Florida. According to my cousin, there had been some kind of incident in the apartment back in the 90s. Someone had died there under unclear circumstances, and the family had attempted to keep it quiet. That was also around the time Aunt Lucy had inherited the building. I have never believed in ghosts. I don't state that to sound dismissive or narrow-minded. I genuinely don't. I believe it's a rather unintelligent way to interpret things you don't comprehend, to be frank. So, when I reflect on what I experienced in that house, I always find myself searching for an alternative explanation. Perhaps Aunt Lucy was sheltering someone up there, a relative in trouble, or someone who needed to remain hidden. Or perhaps she was being blackmailed, compelled to let someone live in her building without anyone knowing. Maybe the incident my cousin mentioned wasn't as resolved as the family wished to believe, and whoever was responsible still held some kind of influence over her. Or perhaps the entire story was completely fabricated, and my cousin was merely gossiping. I truly don't know. What I do know is that my mom possesses information, and I will never forgive her for withholding it from me. I think this is simply one of those things that will forever remain without an explanation.